So this is the final episode of our mini tip series, where I'm going to cover the final 4 sections. The total tip count between these 4 is 331, which is just 1 tip shy of the stages section. So we've got some good material to work with. Well, kinda. We start with techniques. From a more casual experience, this could be a really good section. It actually goes over a good number of mechanics of the game. A lot of them are things we can't really benefit from on this channel though, as we've gone over a lot of them, or they're just a little bit too basic for my liking. There's a few techniques gone over that I am a bit surprised about though, like hit stun shuffling, or moving your shield and whatnot. While it's not like super comprehensive or complicated, I was expecting less, so that's pretty cool. Now to give some warning, this section has a few nitpicks. Just know it's mostly for fun. I do believe in-game tips should avoid ambiguity or even outright misinformation, as that sort of defeats their purpose, but a lot of these ones aren't very serious, unlike a later section. Starting off, there's a tip that mentions how taking damage in midair lets you dodge again. There's always been a bit of a disconnect between the game's terminology and the community's terminology, but when I think damage, I specifically think a change in percent. And if that's the case, this tip technically isn't right, as moves that deal damage but don't make you flinch will not restore your air dodge, such as with Fox's laser. The character has to flinch if they want to get their air dodge back, and I don't know if there's any exceptions to this, but that's my general understanding. Now, whether or not that's a huge deal is something I'll leave to you, but it is something I noticed. Next, a tip mentions how if you grab at the same time as someone else, a so-called grab parry happens. It is a pretty neat mechanic if you both choose rock at the same time, you know? You both get neutralized with a small damage penalty, and that's all. But here's the thing, the last line of the tip says, this can be useful if you can predict the grab. This kinda makes it out to be like a counterattack or something of the sort. But after a grab parry, each party has the same end lag, meaning no one can truly punish here, and you both take damage too. When it comes to punishing a grab I've predicted, I think I'd rather just spot dodge, or jump and land with an aerial, or just move out of the way and hit him. I feel like this grab parry is less of a strategy and more of an accident. Like, I can't think of any examples where doing this is more or even as good as any other basic grab punish. Please, by all means, let me know if you can think of anything there. Speaking of weird mechanics, these tips actually go over crouch canceling. Yeah, that's in the game by the way. I have gone over on the channel before, but I guess it's been a while. Basically, the reason why you might not have known that crouch canceling is present in this game is because it's basically useless. And for those of you who don't know what that is, basically if you're attacked while you're crouching, you'll take less knockback. It sounds nice, but 99 times out of 100 you're better off shielding, spot dodging, or even just jumping away. These being things you can generally do in the same time it takes to crouch. The only niche I've really discovered where crouch canceling could be worth something is if someone is about to hit you with Dragoon, and you're at like 0%. You can't shield this, and it can be risky to spot dodge as if you mess up you can get KO'd at 0%. But if you crouch cancel, while you're basically guaranteed to get hit, there is a good chance you could survive. If you've got good DI and a good recovery and aren't too light. I mean, yeah, that's really it. The reason why I'm bringing this tip up specifically is that it implies something interesting. It says walking while crouched, crawling, won't help at all. In this context, that means you can't crouch cancel while you're crawling. And after testing, yeah, if you're at all crawling while crouched, the effects of the crouch cancel are gone and you take normal knockback. This just baffles me. The mechanic is already so incredibly niche and practically useless that I'm surprised it even got a tip. But the fact that it doesn't work on crawls seems like a really weird nerf. Okay, granted, I don't know how much being able to do it while crawling would actually help its viability, but I figure it could at least widen that niche, maybe? I don't know. Okay, so here's something more interesting. A tip regarding shield stun mentions how if you block an aerial attack, the recovery time is shorter than if you block a grounded attack. When I first read this, I wasn't quite sure of its validity, given how diverse aerials and grounded attacks can be. So I tested a controlled environment with LOONA. Her down tilt does 10.2%, and her full hop nair, the second hit, does the same. And I measured the frames it took from the initial hit to Lucas's first jump frame. For the down tilt it took 16 frames, and for the neutral air it took 12. And I did a few other similar tests and the results were the same. The frame data was quicker if you blocked an aerial compared to a grounded move. So I went to the wiki just to see if there was more information, and sure enough, starting in Smash Ultimate, there were specifications made to the equation for a move's shield stun, and aerials were given a 0.33 number, compared to the normal move's 1, which basically means it's a third as effective on this specific factor. Of course, that isn't the only thing determining shield stun, but it does seem to be a pretty decent factor, which took me by surprise. Oh, and to be thorough, smash attacks are given a 0.725 number, meaning they're about 3/4 as effective as other moves, and indirect attacks, generally being made up of projectiles, are given a 0.29 number, meaning they're 29/100ths as effective as normal moves. It's pretty cool. Also, I just want to very briefly mention this tip that says, hit stun goes down when more players are in a match. Nintendo's use of the word hit stun actually refers to what we call hit lag, which is the stun that happens directly after a move lands before the knockback. This is usually tied to the damage of the move in some way. So in a match with more than 2 players, the 1v1 multiplier goes away, thus decreasing damage overall, which obviously affects this. I haven't really seen any documentation of a specific hit lag reduction mechanic with more players, so that's kinda just what that means, I think. I'm just mentioning this because the terminology is very confusing, as Nintendo's hit stun is very different from what we normally call hit stun. Our hit stun being the lag between taking knockback and being able to move again. Personally, I still think it's kinda odd that this tip is even here, but I'm just making that distinction for you so no one can get too confused by this, like I was initially. Lastly, for this section, there's actually a tip that talks about something I covered in a very recent random facts video, which you can check out for more information, link in the description. But the tip mentions how doing a backwards roll actually leaves you more vulnerable than a forward roll. That is, I assume that's what it's saying. It only says rolling away from the enemy leaves you more vulnerable, which is ambiguous. Like, you can forward roll away from the enemy, you know? But it is pretty likely they're talking about backwards rolls here, so that's pretty cool. Okay, next I'm going to talk about the item section. I had higher hopes for this given the high tip count, but it ultimately just gives one very basic tip per item, and for a few items it just doesn't mention them at all. That paired with how we cover items a lot on this channel, and there was less interesting stuff here than I would have liked, but I've still got some things I do want to talk about. First, a tip about the fake Smash Ball mentions how the vertical and horizontal lines were switched. Now, okay, bear with me. Whenever I see this, my brain automatically thinks it's just a normal Smash Ball, but it's tilted 90 degrees. But now that I'm actually physically working with it, that's not how that works at all. You can make it more accurate by then mirroring it, which does technically work. But yeah, I guess the idea that they just switched the lines makes a lot more sense, huh? Okay, here's where things get a little crazy. The lightning tip mentions that every once in a while it'll shrink you instead while making your opponents bigger. I find this wording very odd because it refers to 2 of the potential backfires of the item, but it implies that they happened at the same time. This isn't the case. It'll either make you smaller or the opponents bigger whenever it backfires. But it doesn't do both at the same time, so this is once again very misleading. Like, I mean, I guess you could argue that by you becoming smaller, the opponent is now technically bigger, but I think you can tell why that still doesn't really work. Also, I'm just kind of overall baffled by the Beast Ball tip. At the start it says if you hit a target before the ball disappears, it'll suddenly change positions and fly towards the target. I mean, this is true, yeah, but it's not a requirement. The ball will always change positions and fly towards the target no matter what, so long as you throw it in any manner. Perhaps they refer to how hitting a player will cause the Beast Ball to target them specifically, whereas in a free-for-all setting the target seems to be random otherwise, but that's still a really weird way for them to word that. But at the end of the tip it says, if it lands a direct hit, it'll hit multiple times after appearing again. I'm still trying to make sure I'm reading this right, but that's just not what happens. When it reappears, it only ever hits once, not multiple times. The only time it could ever hit, quote-unquote, multiple times, is if you re-grab it and re-throw it immediately after. And, that's just not right. So basically, every part of this tip is either wrong or misleading. I almost have to wonder if this was how the Beast Ball used to work before the game released, but they changed it and forgot to change the tip. It's really weird, and to be frank, it kinda drives home the idea that not a ton of effort was put on the tips in this section. Which I guess is fair, because it's becoming incredibly apparent that people rarely read these tips, but still. Oh, and also I did look up a few of these tips in Japanese to see if they were just mistranslations, but the ones I checked said the same thing as their English counterpart, so I don't think that's the case. Speaking of not being right, a tip about Girahim mentions how he deflects any projectiles that he's facing. I knew that he was essentially a big reflector, but the tip makes it sound like only his front half would reflect projectiles, right? That is, you know, the side where he'd be facing them. But no, I'm clearly hitting Girahim's back here, and yet the move gets reflected. Once again, I can't tell if this is a mechanic that got scrapped, or if it's just odd and misleading wording. Oh, but don't worry, we do have a couple of tips that I thought were actually interesting and not just bad. For one, a Shovel Knight tip mentions how his shovel is actually a reflector too. I didn't know this. I think it's because it's a little bit difficult to get this to happen. It's not like just shooting his shovel automatically reflects it. You have to shoot a projectile at him when he's not already doing something else, and that'll trigger the reflect move. So it's pretty easy for the projectiles to just hit him, and that's it. But yes, occasionally he will be able to reflect things. It's pretty cool. And lastly for this section, there's a few tips going over the Pac-Man ghosts, specifically about how each ghost has a predefined movement type. Basically, the way each individual ghost goes about chasing their target is generally the same way they do from the actual Pac-Man games. So for those of you who aren't aware, Blinky, the red ghost, goes the quickest route to a foe, making them a bit more dangerous and aggressive. Inky, the blue one, goes in a random direction opposite of the foe, making them less dangerous but perhaps good for accidental flanks and covering space. Pinky, the, pink one, goes for an ambushing route by trying to get in front of the foe. And Clyde, the orange one, doesn't have any targets, he kinda just does whatever he wants. I think it's really cool that they kept this level of detail here. I certainly didn't know all of this at first. In my experience, it usually results in Blinky and Pinky being the main aggressors, and Inky and Clyde might just accidentally get in the way. Maybe you can remember these basic movement patterns and have an easier time dodging. I feel like things go by too quickly for it to really matter, but Now, you might be thinking to yourself, dang PKBeats, we're already well over 10 minutes into the video and you've still got 2 whole sections left to go over. Well, here's the thing. In the spirit section, I thought it could have been somewhat interesting, but as it turns out, basically all the tips are just talking about surface level things like the game modes you play in order to get the spirits and whatnot. Not really much about the actual mechanics of the individual spirits. Which I guess I'm thankful for because I find this whole section of the game, gameplay-wise, to be really dull and tasking. But even if I did like all this, the tips didn't really offer me anything interesting to go off of. In fact, there's a single tip that says you can equip spirit teams even in regular Smash, which really makes it seem like the fact that you can use spirits in normal gameplay was a side thought to them, despite, in my opinion, probably being the only potentially interesting aspect of them. Okay, I mean, there are 2 tips that could try to scratch this itch, like one that mentions how the improved escape spirit works on a wide variety of effects, like sleep or dizzy or whatever. Or like how the Ice Floor Immunity Spirit works on all forms of freezing. But I'm pretty sure I'd gone over that on the channel. I can't remember, but yeah, that's all. And the final section is Other. This covers the other game modes or functions, like amiibo support or stage builder, and it does so in a pretty surface level manner. This isn't exactly a bad section overall, it's just that anything potentially interesting here is something I've already gone over on the channel, or I just don't feel like is interesting enough. I mean, I guess it reminded me that you can send your amiibo online to do whatever, something I completely forgot about until a few days ago. And it also reminded me of VR in the game, which also slipped my mind. Not that I even have VR, so... Oh, there was a single tip that stood out to me. That being that the timing for item drops in Century Smash or All-Star Smash goes up the more you move and attack. So here I barely moved or attacked, and the first item spawned a minute and 12 seconds in, while here I did quite a bit of moving and attacking and the item spawned in at about 40 seconds. So I mean, that's something I didn't know before and is kinda interesting, but for this section, that's about it. So that's the rest of the tips. Things started falling apart near the end, but I guess that still counts as content. And with that, you've now been informed of basically everything noteworthy from the in-game tips. Of course, these 3 episodes aren't a comprehensive coverage of them all. For that, you're unfortunately going to have to read all the 2,000 plus tips on your own time, but generally this is what I found interesting. Overall, I am whelmed. There were a decent amount of interesting tips, and I did learn a new thing or 2, but the vast majority of them were either very simple, as expected, or things I've already learned, which means if I had read these tips when the game first came out, I could have learned quite a bit more. But then a lot of them were just bad? Mostly misleading, but there were definitely a few here or there that are just factually incorrect, which is kinda crazy, but now you know. So let me know in the comments how you feel about these 3 episodes, what sorts of miniseries you'd like to see going forward, and anything else regarding the in-game tips or Smash or life. Just give me some interactions. It has been a very slow month. And with that, I'd like to thank my patrons Skully, Raighne, Feurolant 700, and everyone else for their support. Stay casual, and I'll see y'all later.